Metiria Turei.
Tēnā koe, Mr Speaker. Tēnā koe,
Tēnā
Te
koe.
Whare. The Green Party is supporting both of these bills. They're very practical changes that are being made, and if there's more discussion to be had in the committee stages, then we'll be open to that. But I just want to briefly address the change that sort of is on most people's minds, which is the changes to the broadcasting allocation and the rules. There's no doubt, sir, that we are now in a new media and really communications environment in New Zealand politics. It's a natural progression that as technology changes and the way people engage with politics and with news and with information, that the law needs to keep up with that. It's certainly true that the rules were unduly restrictive over the use of the broadcasting allocation, and arguably, especially in the last, I think, couple of elections, those of us who have been heavily involved in the decisions around how that allocation is spent for our particular parties, did mean that quite scarce resources were being locked up in old systems that were ineffective. From a public policy point of view, if there is going to be state funding of some kind like this is, then that funding and the use of it needs to be the best possible use of that money, not locked into old technologies that have limited impact. And so as time has changed, the law is finally kind of keeping up with the way that people want to access the information, and I think that that's perfectly reasonable. That's part of the democratic process. We don't want to be funneling public money into outdated forms of communication, particularly on issues as critical as election campaigns. There's a lot of not everybody's into elections and election campaigns, but it is a critical part of our democratic process, and it needs to be taken seriously. So we support these changes. And to be frank too, one of the beneficial changes here is that the funding is not locked into broadcasting time on television in particular and radio. I suspect radio actually has more utility still, but anyone with Netflix knows that TV is kind of making its way out the window, and it really doesn't have the kind of opportunities that it might have in the past for the community to access information about political parties and what they're offering in an election. The rules do still constrain, to some extent, the use of the money, and I think that that's wise too. It is public money and we need to be held accountable for it, and the systems for accountability, I think, are good inside in the legislation, so that expenditure limits still apply, and I think that that's wise. But the bill opens up the channels through which parties can use that state funding to communicate with voters in a way that best enables voters to get access to information. I will say, though, that I've been to, over the years, quite a number of meetings with a broadcaster, their CEO, and other senior officials who have regularly tried to get out of doing broadcasting the opening and closing statements, and who complained about the fact that prime time is required by the law, where they have to use this prime time for political parties. Yeah, the opening and closing broadcasts, and I have zero sympathy for them, frankly, zero sympathy for them at all. If the state broadcaster needs to take real responsibility for their role in promoting and supporting a healthy democracy, and the arguments about having to give up prime time for this was frankly ridiculous. So there's a little bit of me that's like, damn, they kind of get what they wanted after all, but that doesn't matter as much as making sure that our constituencies, the New Zealand public, get access to good information in the way that they need the most. And like I say, TV is kind of making its way out the window anyway. We will continue to support this bill through the remaining stages, or these bills through the remaining stages of the debate. As I say, if there are suggestions for changes to the legislation, we would look at them seriously. But I think that overall the bills are effective. They don't go quite as far as many of the submitters who made requests for changes to these laws asked for, but they are nonetheless sensible steps along the way to a more flourishing and healthy democratic process. Thank you, Mr Speaker.